The title of my talk today is, and I'm kind of on a personal mission this year to get rid of all colons and slashes and parentheses and very 1980s style concepts, those punning concepts from titles. So I have a very simple one-word title, and it's called simply Misdiagnosis. And what that means, I'll explain hopefully in the next few minutes. If someone over there can, perhaps, there's a set of handouts that are right there next to the boom box. So if you can just take it and pass it around. There's something going around, and I'll refer to the text that you're getting later on in the talk. I'd like to begin my talk today by actually addressing something that was mentioned the very first day when we convened upstairs, and that was about the need to put activism back in academic women's studies. While I'm quite sympathetic to the kind of impetus that kind of statement comes from, I will also kind of play the devil's advocate here and say that I actually don't really understand what that means, because for me, academics and activism are actually not mutually exclusive things. Academics, at least academic practice as I understand it and try to participate in myself, is not only reading and writing, but it is teaching. And I would really like us to begin to think of teaching as activism and the classroom experience and pedagogy as a kind of activism in itself. What also follows from that, and this is perhaps a little bit harder to grasp, is I'd also like us to begin to think about activism as a form of teaching, too. This talk, the reason I'm spending so much time in kind of belaboring this point about teaching is because this talk is about a particular teaching moment. So this is a teacherly talk. The classroom itself is the field, as it were, in this case, which makes me both the observer and the observed. I am then my own, to borrow from 19th century anthropology at least, my own modest witness and my own native informant. And this is for the English fellows out there who have come, and I'm very glad to see them. I am, in short, all the kingdom that I possess. Since this is a teaching talk, and I'm going to kind of use a particular pedagogic moment to kind of, ask us to think about certain larger conceptual issues, I also want to kind of tell you a little bit about the place where I teach in terms of sort of facts and numbers and things like that, since numbers have been in the air. In the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, where I teach, women, both at the junior and at the senior level, that means tenure track and tenured, constitute a total of 13%. So 13% women. And this is, of course, a shameful and rather horrifying little data about my home institution. The kind of average in the United States, though, is not that much better. The University of California is currently going through a lawsuit about affirmative action. Their number, by the way, is around 26%. And they used Harvard as an instance of saying, look at them, we're at least doing better than them because they have 13%. This is a kind of a horrible way of trading in misery. Within my own department, which is the Department of English Literature, there are, of 12 junior faculty, which means people who are tenure track and non-tenured, like me. At the professorial level, there are a total of 12, and of those, 3, including myself, are women. The reason I'm mentioning all this is not to kind of make that simple point, oh look, how terrible, how few women there are, because that, I think, is fairly clear to you. But because I'm interested in thinking about ways in which our classroom practice then has to carry that weight of the few numbers, that is, what we're made to stand in for, what we're made to represent, what sort of identifications are taking place across the teacherly podium, from the students to the teachers. And we've been talking a lot about identity today, and I think it's these days it's fairly difficult to talk about identity without actually talking about identification. I'm also the only non-white woman in my department. I'm there are only 2 of us who are not white in my department, period. The other person is a very famous scholar, and is a man. His name is Henry Louis Gates Jr. So the reason I'm telling you all of this is because then the woman of color, which is a devastating kind of combination, I think you can all see, comes to represent too many things all at once, and that doesn't really lead to good 13%. So 13% women. And this is, of course, a shameful and rather horrifying little data about my home institution. The kind of average in the United States, though, is not that much better. The University of California is currently going through a lawsuit about affirmative action. Their number, by the way, is around 26%. And they used Harvard as an instance of saying, look at them, we're at least doing better than them because they have 13%. This is a kind of a way of trading in misery. Within my own department, which is the Department of English Literature, there are, of 12 junior faculty, which means people who are tenure track and non-tenure, like me. At the professorial level, there are a total of 12, and of those, 3, including myself, are women. The reason I'm mentioning all this is not to kind of make that simple point, oh look, how terrible, how few women there are, because that I think is fairly clear to you. But because I'm interested in thinking about ways in which our classroom practice then has to carry that weight of the few numbers, that is, what we're made to stand in for, what we're made to represent, what sort of identifications are taking place across the teacherly podium, from the students to the teachers, and we've been talking a lot about identity today, and I think it's these days it's fairly difficult to talk about identity without actually talking about identification. I'm also the only non-white woman in my department. There are only 2 of us who are not white in my department, period. The other person is a very famous scholar, and is a man. His name is Henry Louis Gates Jr. So the reason I'm telling you all of this is because then the woman of color, which is a devastating kind of combination, I think you can all see, comes to represent too many things all at once, and that doesn't really lead to good pedagogy anywhere, actually. Let us begin then by taking the title of this conference very seriously indeed, Making of Meaning. Here are 2 articles of faith to which I subscribe when it comes to literary studies. The first one is this: the meaning of a literary text lies not in its origin, but in its destination. That is, the literariness of a text lies precisely in the process through which we, the readers, make meaning or sense. This is why I liked the title of this conference, because it actually is talking, the title is about a process, a making of meaning. It is not exactly about the makers of meaning or what sort of meaning is made, and I think it's very important to talk about these kinds of processes. And since I'm linking literariness to process, right, to the way in which not just what is told, but how it's told, that is what I think makes something literary. I think since I'm talking about process, we realize that process is irreducibly linked to form itself. And from there, it really is rather futile then to partition form from content, and so I'm not going to be doing that. The second thing I want to state before I move further is about the relationship between history and literature, which is something that Uma alluded to when she began today's morning session. What is the relationship between history and literature? At least what do I believe the relationship between history and literature is? And let's make it even more specific, between material history and between symbolic culture. I don't think literature is simply something that holds up a mirror to history, something that is out there. And it is also not a byproduct. Although it certainly bears the traces of the historic moment and conditions in which it is produced, very strong traces of that. Literature, or more properly, let's kind of get away from literature with a capital L for the moment, and let's maybe talk about the literary. Literature also, and this is the important point here, subverts, invents, forms, constructs, and even plays with history. This is what makes it different from other forms of textual production. Now, it might sound like an old-fashioned argument, but maybe it is a new-fashioned, old-fashioned argument. I do believe that we live in a textually constituted world in many ways. Yet, at the same time, I do think there is, while other forms of text can yield to literary reading, I think we understand there's something of a difference between a novel and a newspaper. And that's also something we should keep in mind, and I don't want to kind of erase that difference. So finding the exact fault lines between reflection, or let's make it even something like the mimetic, and construction, often forms the large part of the pleasures and difficulties of literary scholarship today. And let me here give you a kind of what I think is a very powerful image to help you understand what at least I'm trying to propose as the relationship between history and literature, material history and symbolic culture. There's a poem by the 20th century American poet Elizabeth Bishop called The Gentleman of Shalat, obviously a riff off of Tennyson's The Lady of Shalat. In that poem, the poem in itself is not the important thing here. The poem has this image of a woman. The woman is half body, it's half flesh. Now imagine a woman, it's half flesh, half mirror. And the part that's flesh is reflected on the side that's mirror. The interesting thing about this poetic creature is that the flesh part is not some sort of a discrete whole, right? This whole thing onto itself, which is simply reflected then in the mirror part. It's the flesh and the side in the mirror that together form the whole. How is this kind of rather bizarre female creation useful to us? I think I'd like to think of the flesh part as something as material history. And I'd like to think of the mirror part as perhaps as art, as the literary, as symbolic culture. And the reason I like this image is because it helps us to kind of think through and theorize what the relationship between the two are. That is, that this history is not this thing, which is this complete, discrete, C-R-E-T-E, discrete, of course, whole thing that is sort of, wonderfully, somehow reflected or subverted or what have you in this other thing, which is also separate, which is art. But it's that the two together form our reality. Now, the problem in the poem is that the line is not a straight line. And there's actually a bit in the poem where the poetic voice says, which side's in, which side's out. That's the problem, this leg or that leg, this arm or that arm. So that kind of slippery, elusive, changing line between that flesh part and the mirror part, that, again, is what I'm calling the fault line. That's what we as literary scholars navigate in trying to make a meaning out of the texts that we read. And which also means that there is, this is, of course, a kind of, not one of those kinds of structures where you can kind of say, and the line is always here, because with each text and each circumstance, that line shifts. That's, again, what I meant about what the continuing pleasures and difficulty of literary theory and criticism today is. Okay. The main topic of today's discussion for me is a book by a novelist from what is now called Zimbabwe. The story actually takes place in 1968, which is when Zimbabwe was, of course, colonial Rhodesia. The name of the novelist is Tsitsi Dangarembga. You should all have a handout in front of you, and I will refer to bits and pieces in it. The title is Nervous Conditions. The larger concern I have here, and you can just sort of pay attention to this if you're going to tune out afterwards as I get more into the novel, this is very simply put the larger question, which is how to read the female figure in a culturally different text. And that's precisely why I chose an African text today, because I wanted us to read something that, again, I'm not going to make assumptions about what is, of course, different for all of us. In fact, I can see somebody directly in front of me who I knew grew up in the African continent. So, but I still think that if in English departments we are going to be pushing for curricular changes and for canonical revisions, etc., all of that, in the subcontinent, that argument cannot be based simply on the kind of, let us include more writers from South Asia, because that, I think, is kind of missing the point of what sort of Anglophone cultures today is. So it simply can't be the, your British and American standard syllabus with, now let's put a little, Salman Rushdie or Babsi Sidwar or who have you in there. I think we have to kind of think slightly differently. The other reason I chose an African text is because I'm, and those of you who know me, know that I'm interested in looking at, of course, connections between the subcontinent and parts of the world other than the so-called West or the North. These are, of course, not new connections. These are historic old connections, but I think we need to kind of rethink our relationship to places like Africa or the Caribbean, Malay Straits, what have you. Tsitsi Dangarembga's Nervous Conditions was published in 1988, although the story begins 20 years earlier in colonial Rhodesia. This is then a talk about a Zimbabwean novel, but as urgently, this is a talk about teaching a Zimbabwean novel in an American university classroom. And I want to make my location here explicitly clear, because you will probably find that there are, of course, going to be differences in our experiences. I teach this novel in two courses. I teach this novel currently this semester. I teach it in two courses. One is a literary theory course, and the other is a course called Postcolonial Narratives. In the theory course, when I teach this novel, I pair it up with two texts. I pair it up with Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, particularly looking at questions of language in the African novel, and John Guillory's Cultural Capital, which is about the ideology of canon formation. When I teach it in the postcolonial class, which is, and I just taught this actually 2 weeks ago, so I'm coming out of it. It's a 14-week semester. They read a novel a week, so this comes right after they've read Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and right before the Sudanese writer Tayyip Salih's modern Arabic classic, Season of Migration to the North, or the pardon my pronunciation here, the Mosam al-Hijra ila al-Shamal. So what the kind of moment, I'm trying to take you into the classroom moment when we begin discussing Dangarembga. We have then just finished Chinua Achebe, and we have been having a discussion about what is it that is lost when things fall apart. And those of you who are familiar with Things Fall Apart, know that brings up certain, it's Okonkwo, the protagonist, has a certain masculinist idea of what his Igbo tribal culture is. And so this is when the students are kind of prepped to think about, wait, let's be a little careful before we kind of rush in to mourn the kind of loss of authentic original culture in the colonial encounter. And this is to kind of prepare them for the next week. So when they're reading Nervous Conditions, they haven't read the Arabic translation yet. And so it's kind of also trying to prepare them to think, and Season of Migrations is kind of a wonderful play on the Othello narrative, the master narrative, okay? And so there is the kind of, one of the main protagonists, the Black Sudanese, goes around raping and killing white women in his time in Britain. And so this is where, again, we're beginning to understand sort of, what kind of anti-colonial stance is that? So this is the kind of moment in which these students are entering this. Let me back up now to talk about Zimbabwe, which I said, when I began, I said I wanted to talk about something that would be a little different from South Asia. Of course, it's not that different, because I think the first time I ever encountered or heard about Zimbabwe was not when, as a child, I had immigrated with my family to the United States, but when, in fact, I was 6 years old and I got my first Indian passport. I was born in India. And I remember that, you remember those cardboard stiff passports before the beautiful, like, soft things came about? I kind of like the cardboardness of it because it really keeps us aware of the fact that borders are frankly not as flexible as some people would like us to think of. You know, this kind of new, sexy, soft border of the new passports are a little tricky. Anyway, so I opened my passport, and I didn't know what a passport was, right? And I had to sign, you know, you have to sign. And so I have my beautiful joining hands, cursive writing, and I'm dutifully signing. And I asked my father, what is a passport? So he, kind of explains to me. I'd never left India at that point, so I had never gone anywhere where I needed to show a piece of paper to go there. Anyways, there was a very interesting thing that was written inside my passport, and it said that, I'm roughly paraphrasing this, of course, because I don't remember it exactly. Basically, something along the lines that this allows me to go everywhere except Rhodesia and South Africa. Now, what is,
Israel.
And Israel, okay, I didn't remember that one. I wonder why I repressed that, okay. So now I have no idea why. I mean, this made no sense, right? Imagine you're 6 years old, you've just been given a piece of paper and you're told that this allows you to go places, and the first thing you read is that it actually, in fact, also restricts where you can go. So I got the kind of, little kids version of the sort of the history of race and apartheid in Rhodesia, and I learned about, this fellow called Cecil Rhodes. Years later, I would encounter this very same Cecil Rhodes, who lends his name graciously to colonial Rhodesia in the form of a very elite and fancy fellowship, right? That even those Indians who would, not go to Rhodesia because of certain politics. I'll be paraphrasing this, of course, because I don't remember it exactly. Basically, something along the lines that this allows me to go everywhere except Rhodesia and South Africa. Now, what is,
Israel.
And Israel, okay, I didn't remember that one. I wonder why I repressed that, okay. So now I have no idea why. I mean, this made no sense, right? Imagine you're 6 years old, you've just been given a piece of paper and you're told that this allows you to go places, and the first thing you read is that it actually, in fact, also restricts where you can go. So I got the kind of, little kids version of the sort of the history of race and apartheid in Rhodesia, and I learned about, this fellow called Cecil Rhodes. Years later, I would encounter this very same Cecil Rhodes, who lends his name graciously to colonial Rhodesia in the form of a very elite and fancy fellowship, right? That even those Indians who would, not go to Rhodesia because of certain politics. Let's face it, the Rhodes Scholarship is still, carries quite a bit of cultural capital all over the world. So this is sort of the two ways in which, before, I had any other knowledge about Rhodesia, these were the two contradictory ways in which, as a child in South Asia, I had begun to think about this place. Okay. Written in 1988, 8 years after colonial Rhodesia became independent, Rhodesia became Zimbabwe in 1980, a rather late date, actually, think about that. This novel is set in colonial Rhodesia because it begins in 1968, 20 years before the present time when it's published. It's a story of a young woman, and it's a story which takes place it starts when she's 13 years old in 1968, and basically it sort of follows her for the next 8 years of her life. So this is, of course, that coming of age tale. It's a novel of education. It's the female Bildungsroman, in short. There are actually twin protagonists in this. There are two. So there's the young girl. Her name is Tembu. And she is from a very large family. There are 8 or 9 brothers or sisters. And they're very poor. They live in a homestead, right? They live in kind of a rural area. She has an uncle who is the kind of, quote-unquote, using the language of the book, is the kind of the Black Rhodesian made good, which is he's one of those people who's very smart. He had gotten a scholarship. He had an opportunity to go abroad. And so it's on him that the whole family looks to raise them out of poverty. This uncle, his name is Baba Mukuru, and this will all make sense when I direct your attention to the text itself, has a daughter. Her name is Nyasha. So Nyasha and Tambu are the sort of twin protagonists. Nyasha really sort of the bourgeois young girl who had been to England as a young child, who reads a certain kind of history, who possesses a certain kind of vocabulary of politics and gender and all of that. And Tambu, who doesn't, but who wants to kind of acquire that education for a very different kind of reason. In order to understand this Bildungsroman, and let me even add a further layer to this, that sort of female post-colonial Bildungsroman, a coming-of-age story about a colonized Black African woman, we have to simultaneously address the signification of these very large, seemingly homogeneous categories: Black, African, colonized, and finally, for our purposes, woman. I'm going to read to you from the first paragraph, and you don't have this in your Xerox handout. This is just to show you how this novel begins. I was not sorry, chapter 1. I was not sorry when my brother died, nor am I apologizing for my callousness, as you may define it, my lack of feeling, for it is not that at all. I feel many things these days, much more than I was able to feel in the days when I was young and my brother died. And there are reasons for this more than the mere consequence of age. Therefore, I shall not apologize, but begin by recalling the facts as I remember them that led up to my brother's death, the events that put me in a position to write this account. That's a very important statement there. The events that put me in a position to write this account. For though the event of my brother's passing and the event of my story cannot be separated, my story, after all, is not about death, but about my escape and Lucia's aunt, about my mother's and my aunt's entrapment, about Nyasha's rebellion, Nyasha, far-minded and isolated, my uncle's daughter, whose rebellion may not in the end have been successful. Part of the force of this novel is derived from its obvious kind of move towards questioning of white, middle-class, Euro-American feminism as representative of complex and widely differing global conditions. And the novel really kind of, there's a kind of structural tension in the novel between, on the one hand, talking about the specificities of being Black and being a female, and the kind of, at the same time, and add poor to that too, this on the specific side, and notice on the other side, the sort of tension between seeing these gender inequalities as something that cuts through race, class, culture. And I will now kind of read to you two little bits and want you to juxtapose them to understand the structural tension of the novel. My mother, this is when Tambu, the protagonist, says that, his mother is this illiterate, poor woman, and she really kind of idolizes that aunt, the aunt of hers who's much more educated and all of that, and she just told her mother that, she's a better wife than you. My mother was too old to be disturbed by my childish nonsense. She tried to diffuse some of it by telling me many things, by explaining that my father was right, because even my bru, that's the aunt, knew how to cook, clean, and grow vegetables. This business of womanhood is a heavy burden, she said. How could it not be? Aren't we the ones who bear children? When it is like that, you can't just decide today I want to do this, tomorrow I want to do that, the next day I want to be educated. When there are sacrifices to be made, you are the one who has to make them. And these things are not easy. You have to start learning them early, and from a very early age. The earlier the better, so that it is easy later on. Easy. As if it is ever easy. And these days, it is worse. The poverty of Blackness on one side, and the weight of womanhood on the other. This is one side of the structural tension. The other side, and this is later in the novel, when she's moved in with her uncle's family, and she begins to notice that this kind of burden of, on the one hand, there's a specific burden of being poor and Black and a woman, but there's also something which cuts across those very lines. And the moment here is her cousin Nyasha has just had a kind of an episode of an incredible fight with her father because she wanted to go out dancing and she smokes, she sneaks smokes and she wears short skirts, etc. And this fight kind of culminates in the father slapping Nyasha, and Nyasha hits back, which is when the father says, "You're a whore." "Nyasha," this is Tambu now. "Nyasha," I said as she walked past me, but she did not answer. I followed her to the servants' quarters where we sat, she smoking a cigarette held between shaking fingers, and I feeling bad for her, and thinking how dreadfully familiar the scene had been, with Baba Mukuru condemning Nyasha to whoredom, making her a victim of her femaleness, just as I had felt victimized at home in the days when Nhamo, that's the brother, went to school and I grew my maize. The victimization I saw was universal. It didn't depend on poverty, on lack of education, or on tradition. It didn't depend on any of these things, though I had thought it had depended on. Men took it everywhere with them. Even heroes like my uncle did it. And that was the problem. You had to admit that Nyasha had no tact. You had to admit that she was altogether too volatile and strong-willed. You couldn't ignore the fact that she had no respect for her father when she ought to have had lots of it. But what I didn't like was the way all conflicts came back to this question of femaleness, as opposed to and inferior to maleness. So that is one sort of structural tension. Now let me kind of add, what this will take you to this, the handout I have for you, and sort of what the meaning of misdiagnosis here is. I had suggested that this is also a post-colonial coming-of-age story, and post-colonial in both senses, the historic definition as in after decolonization, also the ideological definition, but that is anti-colonial. What is the problem of reading a coming-of-age story about a young woman as a post-colonial coming-of-age story? That is, what's the problem in linking the nation to this coming-of-age of a young girl? There's at least one scholar, a Marxist at that, who has made an argument that all third world narratives are national allegories. Another one, of course, from India, who is, the first one is, I'm not being quiet, that's Frederick Jameson, for those of you who are interested. Of course, Ijaz Ahmed from India has taken him on that. So, what is the problem here of beginning to see Tambu's story, right? The story of this young girl from 13 to 18, as also the story of a nation, the story of Zimbabwe's emergence from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe.